So, continuing on our conversation about weapons of mass destruction and sort of the security challenge they pose for the international system, I think we should talk a little bit about nuclear weapons and some of the different logics around their use and some of the different ways that states have tried to navigate the security challenge that comes with potentially, world-ending military technology. And so when we talk about nuclear weapons, it's important, I think, probably to separate out the tactical versus strategic sides of nuclear weapons. When we're talking about tactical nuclear weapons, we're talking about weapons that might be used on a small scale, on a battlefield situation. We're not talking about sort of a total nuclear exchange between superpowers like the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, where the thinking was that that kind of an exchange would end life on Earth because it would involve thousands of warheads. Those would be strategic nuclear weapons, right? They're large yield weapons that potentially can wipe out cities. They're oftentimes mounted onto intercontinental ballistic missiles, although they don't necessarily have to be, but oftentimes were during the Cold War for reasons we'll talk about. And they're intended basically to be used in large numbers, either to destroy an adversary's nuclear arsenal on the ground, targeting silos or air bases, or to strike what are called counter value targets, targets that would be of such pain to lose that you would start thinking seriously about whether this is worthwhile. Again, I'm coding my language. What we're talking about is the targeting of cities and the destruction of cities. And again, strategic nuclear weapons are really intended for this like large scale exchange. Tactical weapons are really used for a battlefield situation, right? That you want to hit a particular massing of troops or strike at a particular ship. They're likely, if they are ever to be used in a war fighting situation, to be used in relatively small numbers. They're likely to be used against a conventional threat, again, troops massing, ships out at sea. And they generally have smaller yields, right? We're talking about things that are, destroying something the size of a city block or two rather than an entire city. And they're oftentimes deployed either with intermediate or short range rockets, possibly even artillery could launch these tactical nuclear weapons. So this conversation is going to be largely focused on strategic nuclear weapons. Tactical nuclear weapons will set aside as something that I really hope we never have to see or deal with or strategize about, but also the stakes are far lower with tactical nuclear weapons. There's sort of an assumption that tactical nuclear weapons could be used without triggering a strategic nuclear exchange, although that is an assumption. As we're thinking about sort of how nuclear weapons operate, it's maybe useful to think back to or reflect on this idea of the offense-defense balance, which is a concept that security scholars use to think about whether or not it makes more sense to attack or to defend given the overall structure of technology and forces and their deployment within the international system. So a shorthand for that is the advantage with the attacker or is the advantage with the defender? And some of that comes down to technology, right? There are some technologies that are overwhelmingly dominant in warfare and have inherent offensive or defensive capabilities that factor into sort of how stable the international system is because of how advantageous it is for attacking or defending. So castles are I think a good example of a preeminent military technology. For hundreds and hundreds of years, castles were what people invested in terms of military technology to ensure their safety and security. And castles are really great defensive technology, right? You cannot use a castle to attack. If your neighbor is building a castle, you think to yourself, they're trying to protect themselves, not they're preparing to attack me. Castles don't get used in that way because they're big and heavy and immobile. Also, they're really miserable to attack because of hot oil being poured down and all sorts of nasty tricks that get worked into the defense of castles. And so for a long time, castles were the preeminent military technology until about the mid 15th century, 1450 something. The Ottoman Turks show up at the gates of Constantinople and basically in the morning punch through the walls using cannon that were heavier than cannon that had ever been used before. And essentially in one morning demonstrated that castles are no longer an effective military technology. And if you want to have security, if you want to have a functioning military, you need to invest in cannon, not in castles. Or if you do invest in castles, you sure as heck better put cannon on top of them so they can get further range out than the cannon that are moving in the field. And this changed the balance of the international system because cannon, unlike castles, are offensive technologies. You put them on wheels, you put them behind a horse, you roll them around, you can use them to attack, and suddenly the balance shifted. And so part of the argument is that technologies can be used for offense, some can be used for defense, some are exclusively for offense or defense. If you are building a long-range bomber, that's a pretty good sign that you're preparing for offense. Nobody builds long-range bombers to protect their territory. For that, you build short-range fighters. And nuclear weapons sort of work like this as well, but we have to think about a couple different things in terms of determining whether they're going to be offensive or defensive. We have to think about sort of internal factors like the scale of deployment. How many of these things do you have, and what are you doing with them? Are they sitting in warehouses, or are they launched on bolted onto missiles? And you need to think about external factors too, such as who else in the international system has these weapons, and what's the scale, and how are they deployed. And so as we talk through that, I want to, I guess, present three different scenarios about how nuclear weapons might function. Right? And so in one scenario, really only one country has nuclear weapons. And in that scenario, nuclear weapons are offensive weapons. They are incredibly powerful tools of war, and when they're used, there is really no comparable retaliation that's possible. We were in this world for a short period of time. It happened to coincide with World War II, but it took the United States a matter of seconds to decide, once it had the technology in nuclear weapons, to use it in warfare against Japan. And did so effectively with essentially no consequences. That world lasted for less than a decade before the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons as well. And within about 2 decades from the end of World War II, we were in a situation where both the United States and the Soviet Union had massive stockpiles of nuclear weapons. And they deployed them in such a way that they had a secure second strike. What that means is that no matter what you do, the other side is always going to be able to retaliate and launch an overwhelming nuclear retaliatory strike. They're going to hit back, and they're going to be able to hit back in such a scale and in such a painful way that nuclear war becomes unthinkable and massively destructive, and something that nobody would ever in their right mind engage in. And in that world, nuclear weapons have shifted from being an offensive technology that you use in warfare to a technology that you would never use in warfare, that would be unthinkable. And yet, both the United States and the Soviet Union sat upon massive stockpiles. The United States invested, the equivalent of about $20 trillion over the Cold War, building up its nuclear stockpile, because nuclear weapons, strategic nuclear weapons, are the biggest, baddest castle humanity has ever designed. It is a deterrent where everybody who does the calculation looks at that deterrent, that castle, that defensive technology, and says engaging in warfare on a large scale against this country is unthinkable and should never be undertaken. But when you have multiple countries with nuclear weapons, and one country has effective defensive technology that's able to neutralize the secure second strike of others, then suddenly nuclear weapons shift back to being offensive weapons again. Because countries believe that they can potentially launch nuclear weapons, use them in war, and neutralize the consequences, shoot down incoming missiles. Or other countries look at a country that has some defensive technology and note, well, they have defensive technology, but it's not going to be perfect. If I'm going to have any chance at all, I need to launch first, and launch with an overwhelming strike that overwhelms their defensive capabilities, and sure, we'll lose half, 3/4 of our delivery vehicles and warheads, but enough we'll get through to make it absolutely devastating, but only if we strike first. And so something really weird happens when you muddle with that calculation of a secure second strike, that suddenly people start doing the calculation of, so should I be launching first with these weapons? Should I be using them in an offensive way? And the calculation almost comes down to, it's better to launch first than second. when there is defensive technology in play. And so getting a secure second strike is really, really important. And it's also really challenging. Most countries don't have the ability to sustain a secure second strike capability around nuclear weapons. And that's really important if these weapons are going to function as defensive technologies, as a deterrent. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union relied upon multiple delivery vehicles. So the United States organized its nuclear forces around the triad of long-range bombers equipped with nuclear warheads that kind of hovered at the edge of Soviet airspace with enough fuel to reach their targets. And as soon as that fuel started running low, they turned back while another wave of bombers sort of took off to kind of replace them in their sort of prepared strike pattern. The United States had intercontinental ballistic missiles sort of peppered across the West and the Midwest and in sparsely populated areas like North Dakota, with the thinking that these would be a reserve force of nuclear weapons that would potentially either be useful as a second strike or would be useful as absorbing incoming Soviet missiles, drawing them away from more populated areas. And then thirdly, the United States relied upon intercontinental ballistic missiles that were placed in nuclear submarines that were able to essentially go out into the deep oceans and hide and just wait. And so if they were needed, they could pop up and they could launch a nuclear strike. So there was the deployment piece, but that's only one part of it. There also has to be confidence that the communication infrastructure supporting a secure second strike is going to function, right? And so that means shielding all of your military hardware to protect it against an electromagnetic pulse. If a nuclear blast is set off in the atmosphere and fries all the electronics, you need to make sure that your military communication systems are still going to operate so that the president can communicate to Strategic Air Command and to the various components of the triad and say, it's time to launch, here's your targets, here's your directions. You also need to make sure that command and control process holds in place. And so the U.S. actually rewrote the Constitution, added an amendment to the Constitution specifying sort of the order of succession down through all the cabinet positions, something that just hadn't existed in the Constitution before. Also laying out provisions for what happens if a president is sedated, goes under for surgery, who has the authority in that moment to press the button and launch nuclear warfare. So, organizing your command and control and making sure that that's stable is really important, and detection is really important. And so the U.S. set up radar systems all across the world so that it could pick up and detect incoming Soviet missiles fast enough that there would be a window of time available for the United States to respond. 15 to 30 minutes would be ideal. So all of that's really important, and all of that's really difficult. And in fact, it's not even clear if the Soviet Union had all of that during the Cold War. There was a kind of famous event where a pilot was able to fly from Iceland through like Scandinavian airspace and into the Soviet Union, and then crossed a good chunk of the Soviet Union into Moscow. And apparently their radar systems didn't pick up this small plane, which is kind of terrifying given that detection of things violating your airspace is a really central part of making a secure second strike work. And so when this pilot lands in Red Square, this is sort of one of the most terrifying moments in the Cold War, because it demonstrates that the Soviet Union's air defense and radar networks are spotty at best. This is pretty common, though. There was a plane that went missing out of Malaysia a number of years ago, and one of the hypotheses was that it had been hijacked and stolen and taken to Afghanistan, and it would have flown across India to get to Afghanistan. And so India was asked, do you have any evidence, the plane crossed through? And India said, well, we don't really have radar coverage across sort of northern India, which is a very strange thing to say, given that India has border disputes with Pakistan and border disputes with China, and you would assume that that would be airspace that they'd be monitoring pretty carefully and pretty closely. But it turns out that most countries don't have this ability. Now, there are ways to get around some of this. In the case of India and Pakistan, neither country really has the kind of arsenals that we saw between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. There's no reason to think that they're able to conduct mutually assured destruction in which the world essentially ends. We'll talk about that in a second. but maybe they've relied upon other strategies, using smaller arsenals to make nuclear strikes painful and to make it very, very difficult to destroy each other's nuclear arsenals. That may involve just simply putting nuclear weapons on trucks and hustling them around the country so that they're always sort of enough on the move that you can retaliate if you need to, that your second strike is secure. Through maybe more creative ways. The United Kingdom relies upon submarines with nuclear launched, or nuclear weapons that can be launched from submarines. So a lot of important components. People get creative when they're not able to do all of the pieces simultaneously. But this kind of returns us back to a conversation about, so what should you be doing with nuclear weapons? What should you be planning for and thinking about? And there's really two schools of thought on this. One is the mutually assured destruction school. As I mentioned that phrase earlier, but it's essentially a story that says you want to build your nuclear forces in such a way that you have a secure second strike, and then it's absolutely clear to everybody that there's no way to engage in a nuclear exchange without it being mutually destructive, that there's going to have total destruction, that it's going to be a world-ending event. And when that is utterly clear to people, right, that fear of a retaliatory second strike is going to deter any use of nuclear weapons, that mutually assured destruction is the way to make nuclear weapons safe and stable and ensure that they never are used by total transparency. And so if that's the argument you want to go with, you're thinking about how to make that secure second strike very clear. Maybe you even bring in your adversary and show them around and show them strategic air command. Say, look, all the communications infrastructure is shielded against an impulse. Maybe you put in place treaties that allow for flyover. Look, you can fly once a year over our nuclear silos and determine, yes, there are 1,000 nuclear silos out there along this route that you've chosen to fly. There's lots of things that you can do to kind of make all of this very clear to everybody so that you never find yourself in this situation. Nuclear utilization theory is far less optimistic that transparency and overwhelming clarity about secure second strikes are going to prevent and deter all uses of nuclear weapons. Nuclear utilization theory talks a lot more about tactical nuclear weapons and how tactical nuclear weapons might possibly escalate into a strategic exchange. There's a lot of talk about trust, about whether you can actually trust that your adversary is going to be able to do this calculation and not convince themselves that there's some magic trick that they've come up with that's going to allow them to win a nuclear exchange. And so because of all of these sort of ways in which nuclear utilization theorists sort of envision a nuclear war spilling out, it says that this whole focus on mutually assured destruction and transparency and large arsenals and secure second strike is really missing the point, that what we need to do is invest in the kind of technologies that would allow us to fight and win a nuclear war. So that might mean building a national missile defense system, right, that would allow for shooting down of incoming nuclear weapons. That's possibly a strategy. Maybe you want to develop stealth technology so that you're able to launch a preemptive strike and destroy your adversary's nuclear weapons on the ground before they're ever able to be launched. That might be part of winning a nuclear war, which is what nuclear utilization theory says that you should do. The problem with a lot of these kinds of technologies, and I'll talk about missile defense here, but stealth technology, a lot of the insights kind of bleed over there. The problem with developing these kind of defensive technologies that would allow for countries to use nuclear weapons in warfare and to believe that they're actually able to win a nuclear exchange. The challenge of that, well, I'll start with the reason why you might want to do that. And so if I was going to make the best case for nuclear utilization theory and developing these kind of technologies, I would say, look, there are possibly states out there that just can't be deterred, right? Maybe there are states with people who are insane or who are approaching a moment of crisis and are thinking, hell, I'll just flip the table and end life on Earth for everybody. There was a moment during the last days of the Nixon administration when President Nixon kind of impressed himself on his Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, and they had Kissinger pray to a portrait of Lincoln, and it kind of freaked Kissinger out to the point where he felt that Nixon was really unstable, and phoned over to the Secretary of Defense and said, if the president gives the order to launch nuclear weapons, disregard that order. You might find yourselves in these kind of situations where a country might choose to just simply launch out of whatever mental anguish and crisis that is, right? So that's a possibility. You could also point out that the Cold War deterrence worked reasonably well, because it was just the United States and the Soviet Union. But every time you add in an additional state with nuclear weapons, right? So then it was France and Britain and China and India and Pakistan and North Korea and Israel's in there somewhere, right? That's a lot of countries who have nuclear weapons, and the likelihood that mistakes will happen, the likelihood that you'll have one of those, breakdown moments, just goes up. And so it seems just prudent to be able to respond to that. But if I was going to counter that argument, I would flag that it really threatens to destabilize mutually assured destruction. That if your adversary believes that that their second strike is vulnerable and can be shot down and can be destroyed, that's going to increase their calculation about, I should strike first, use the weapons I have while I still have them, try to overwhelm that system. And there's good reason to think that you can overwhelm these systems. Missile defense works reasonably well against short and maybe even medium range missiles that are traveling at maybe Mach 1 to Mach 3. Even when we talk about hypersonic missiles, we're really only talking about weapons that are traveling about Mach 5, which is fast. But intercontinental ballistic missiles, as they're coming in toward their target, are approaching Mach 20 plus. The challenge of actually targeting and hitting these things is astronomical, and so they almost certainly could be overwhelmed with a massive strike. But part of the problem is that countries simply just don't know what those capabilities would be. They don't know what they would actually look like, and so it just adds uncertainty into the whole calculation that mutually assured destruction says should be neat and clean and clear and obvious and should have no ambiguity about it whatsoever. Nuclear weapon use is terrible. So this is one pushback against missile defense. It might not work, and it certainly increases uncertainty in making a nuclear exchange more likely. But there's another argument out there that I think is really worth digging into, and that is that oftentimes you'll get this argument that you're deterring against crazy states or rogue states or terrorist organizations with missile defense. And that's actually not the case, because nobody in their right minds launches a missile at a country with effective missile defense. If you believe that your adversary has missile defense and you want to launch one nuclear weapon against them, you don't do it with a missile. You put it in a cargo container and float it across and park it in a port. You put it in a truck and drive it across the border, packed in kitty litter or bananas, both of which give off a radioactive signature and would be hard to detect a nuclear weapon moving in that way, right? So you find alternative delivery vehicles that can't be shot down by missile defense if you believe that that's likely to happen, and you're seeking to launch one of these one-off crazy strikes. So adds uncertainty, makes a nuclear exchange more likely, and doesn't actually provide any additional security is my critique of missile defense systems, particularly for intercontinental ballistic missiles.